My name's Matt, and I'm a 37-year-old guy living in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas. I've been married to my wife, Jessica, 35, for 9 years, and we have 2 kids, Ethan, 8, and Lily, 5. On paper, we had what you'd call a picture-perfect life. Decent jobs, a comfortable home, family vacations, soccer games on the weekends. Jess is, or was, my best friend. She's funny, smart, and drop-dead gorgeous, and I always felt lucky to have her. Our sex life wasn't wild, but it wasn't dead either. We were the couple who would host neighborhood barbecues and still sneak kisses in the kitchen while flipping burgers. But for the past 6 months, something's been off. At first, I chalked it up to the usual stress of life. Work had been a bit crazy for me, and Jess had started a new yoga class and was spending a lot of time at the studio. I thought she was just finding her balance, like we all do. Looking back, the first real sign was how often she started being glued to her phone. Jess had always been a leave the phone on the counter type, but now, it was like an extra limb. She'd text late at night, giggling at something, but when I'd ask what was so funny, she'd just wave it off, "Oh, just the group chat with the girls." I didn't think much of it at first. But then, her behavior started to change more noticeably. She became distant, less affectionate, more irritable over little things. She'd sigh when I hugged her, roll her eyes when I tried to joke around. The part of me that's overly trusting thought she was just tired, maybe a little burned out. The part of me that's paranoid started wondering if it was something else. I brushed it off. Because who really wants to believe their wife of almost a decade might be stepping out on them? So, about a month ago, I started noticing little things that didn't add up. One Saturday, Jess said she was going to meet her friend Amanda for brunch. Totally normal, except later that night, Amanda posted pictures on Instagram, pictures of her hiking with her boyfriend at a state park 2 hours away. No brunch in sight. When Jess came home that day, she was all smiles, acting like nothing was off. She even brought home leftover pancakes, like she was covering her tracks. I didn't say anything right then, but it planted a seed in my head. Something wasn't right. The tipping point came 2 weeks ago. She left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to put Lily to bed. Normally, I wouldn't touch her phone, like, ever, but a notification popped up, and I glanced over. It was a text from someone named Chris, and it read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. You're amazing." I'm not proud of this, but I picked up her phone and unlocked it. Yes, I know her passcode, it's our anniversary. I went into her messages, and there it was, a thread with Chris. Flirty texts. Inside jokes I didn't understand. And then the bombshell, a string of messages from earlier that day where they were planning their next meetup. One of the texts read, "Matt won't even notice. He's too busy with work." I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the phone. I scrolled up and saw messages dating back months. They talked about hotels, sneaking around, even how guilty she felt but how worth it was. The final nail in the coffin was a picture. She'd sent him a selfie, nothing explicit, just her sitting in our bedroom wearing the shirt I'd bought her last Christmas. The shirt I'd complimented her on that morning. That's when I knew this wasn't just some emotional fling. She'd lied to my face. This wasn't something I could ignore. I put her phone down and walked outside. My heart was racing, my head spinning. I wanted to scream, cry, punch something, all at once. Instead, I just stood there in the driveway, staring at the stars and wondering, how the hell did I not see this coming? When she came downstairs, I acted normal. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed to think about what I was going to say and how I was going to handle this without completely losing it. But in that moment, I knew, life as I knew it was over. I didn't wait long to confront her. The next evening, after the kids were in bed, I asked Jess if we could talk. She looked a little surprised, but she sat down on the couch. I was trying so hard to keep my voice steady, but my hands were shaking, and I couldn't look her in the eyes at first. I started with, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" Her face went blank for a second. Then, she forced a laugh and said, "What are you talking about?" She had this nervous energy, fidgeting with her wedding ring. I pressed on. "I saw the texts, Jess. Between you and Chris." Her face instantly turned pale, like all the blood drained out of it. Then she did what I didn't expect, she started crying. But not the kind of crying that makes you feel sympathy. It was the panicked, guilty kind. "Matt, I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she stammered. "That hit me like a freight train. Didn't mean for me to find out." So it was true. All of it. My chest felt like it was going to explode. I kept my voice steady, though my anger was bubbling just below the surface. "How long, Jess? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then said, "A few months." It started, innocently. Her voice cracked. "We met at yoga. He's a friend of Amanda's. We were just texting at first, and then," she trailed off, looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, like she was begging me to fill in the blanks so she didn't have to say the words. "Don't make me do this," I said, my voice rising. "Say it. Did you sleep with him?" She broke down completely. "Yes. But it didn't mean anything, Matt. I swear. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. I love you, I love our family." That's when I lost it. A mistake? A mistake? I was yelling now, and I didn't care. "You've been sneaking around for months, lying to my face, putting our family on the line, and you're telling me it didn't mean anything? Do you think I'm an idiot?" She started rambling, almost incoherently. "It wasn't like that, it wasn't planned. I felt lonely, Matt. You've been so busy with work, and we've been distant, and Chris, he just made me feel wanted again." I stared at her in disbelief. "So this is my fault? You cheated because you were feeling lonely? And instead of talking to me, you ran off to someone else?" She shook her head furiously. "No, I didn't mean it like that. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. Please, please let me explain." I couldn't even look at her. "You don't get to explain. Not after this. You betrayed me, Jess. You betrayed us." She kept crying, reaching for me, but I stood up and walked out of the room. I needed air, space, anything to get away from her and the suffocating weight of what she'd done. That night, I slept on the couch. She texted me from upstairs, asking if we could talk more, but I didn't respond. I stared at the ceiling all night, my mind replaying every lie, every excuse, every time she'd come home late or smiled at her phone. All the little things I ignored because I trusted her. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck and the kind of emotional hangover that makes you feel like you've been hit by a train. Jess was in the kitchen, making coffee like everything was normal. When I walked in, she looked at me, her face a mess of dried tears and regret. "Matt, please, can we talk?" she said softly. I ignored her and went straight for the coffee pot. I couldn't even look at her without feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and something worse, betrayal. This was the woman I had loved for nearly a decade, the mother of my kids. And now? She felt like a stranger. The next few days were a blur. I went to work, but I couldn't focus. I'd sit at my desk, replaying everything in my head. The texts. Her excuses. The way she tried to turn it into our problem instead of her betrayal. Every time I thought about her with him, my stomach churned. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I was barely holding it together for Ethan and Lily, who, thankfully, were too young to sense that their world was falling apart. At night, Jess would try to talk to me, but I shut her down every time. "I can't do this right now," I'd say, and she'd cry and go back upstairs. Part of me wanted to yell, to scream at her and make her feel the pain she'd caused. But another part of me didn't even have the energy. The worst part was how much doubt crept in. I started questioning everything. Every girls' night out, every business trip she'd taken over the years, had those been real? Or had there been other, Chris, types before him? My mind spiraled into this dark place where I couldn't trust anything she'd ever told me. And then there were the kids. Ethan and Lily are my whole world. I kept thinking about what this would do to them if it came out. Would they blame me if we split up? Would they grow up thinking this was somehow their fault? I didn't want to be the guy who tore their family apart, but at the same time, how could I stay with someone who had betrayed me so completely? One night, Jess finally cornered me. "Matt," she said, her voice trembling, "I know I don't deserve it, but I need to say this. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for what I've done to you, to us, to our family. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. Just please, don't give up on us." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But how do you rebuild something that's been shattered into a million pieces? I told her I needed space to think, and for the first time, she didn't push. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face, and went upstairs. That night, I broke down for the first time. I sat on the floor of the living room, crying like I hadn't cried since I was a kid. It was the kind of grief that makes you feel hollow, like a piece of you has been ripped out and you're not sure if you'll ever get it back. After a week of sleepless nights and endless internal debates, I knew I had to make a decision. Staying in this limbo wasn't good for anyone, not for me, not for Jess, and certainly not for Ethan and Lily. I was torn between two conflicting instincts, the desire to protect my family and the need to protect myself from further hurt. I sat down with a notebook one night after the kids were asleep and made a list. On one side, reasons to stay. On the other, reasons to leave. Reasons to stay. 1. The kids. 2. Almost a decade of history. 3. The small part of me that still loved her. Reasons to leave. 1. She lied to me for months. 2. She broke the trust we built over 9 years. 3. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was Chris. The list didn't give me clarity, it just made the decision feel heavier. But something clicked when I read over the reasons to stay. I wasn't thinking about what was best for me, I was thinking about everyone else. That realization hit me hard. If I didn't take care of myself first, how could I take care of my kids? The next morning, I told Jess we needed to have a serious conversation. We sat at the dining table, the same one where we'd celebrated birthdays, done homework with the kids, and talked about our future. The air between us felt icy and thick, like it would crack if either of us moved too quickly. "Jess," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "I've thought about this a lot. And I can't just go back to how things were. You broke something in us, and I don't know if it can ever be fixed." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't want to make any rash decisions," I continued. "For the kids' sake, I think we need to take this slow. I'll stay in the house for now, but I want us to live separately. No pretending everything is fine, no sweeping this under the rug. If we have any chance of fixing this, we need to rebuild from the ground up." Jess nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything." "I'll go to therapy with you," I said, surprising even myself. "But not for the marriage. For co-parenting. I need to figure out how we're going to raise Ethan and Lily without letting this mess ruin their childhood." It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but I didn't care. I needed to focus on the kids, on getting through this without letting my anger and sadness consume me. As much as I wanted to pack a bag and leave right then, I knew that wasn't realistic. The kids deserved stability, even if it was temporary. That night, I slept in the guest room for the first time. It was a weird mix of relief and sadness, like a physical acknowledgement that our marriage was no longer the same. Jess knocked on the door before bed and handed me a piece of paper. "This is the contact info for a therapist," she said softly. "I already made an appointment for myself. You don't have to go if you're not ready, but I thought it might help." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. After she left, I sat there staring at the paper. I wasn't sure if therapy would fix anything, but at that moment, it was the only thread of hope I could cling to. The following week, Jess went to her first therapy session. I didn't ask her about it, and she didn't volunteer much information beyond, "It was hard, but I think it helped." I wasn't ready to hear about her self-discoveries yet. It felt too raw, too soon. A few days later, I had my own session. Sitting in that sterile, overly decorated office with a stranger staring at me was awkward as hell. The therapist, Dr. Walker, was this older guy with a kind face and a voice that sounded like he'd narrated meditation tapes in another life. "So, Matt," he started, "what brings you here today?" I let out a bitter laugh. "What doesn't? My wife cheated on me. My marriage is in shambles. I feel like a failure as a husband, and I don't know how to keep it from screwing up my kids' lives." Dr. Walker nodded like he'd heard it all before. "That's a lot to carry. Let's unpack it, piece by piece." The first session was mostly me venting. I told him everything, how I'd found out, how Jess had tried to justify it, how I felt like my world had been flipped upside down. Saying it all out loud felt both cathartic and devastating. By the end, I was emotionally drained, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny sliver of clarity. He left me with a thought that stuck: "Matt, you've been deeply hurt, and that pain is valid. But healing isn't about justifying what happened, it's about deciding what kind of life you want to build moving forward." Meanwhile, Jess and I went to a joint session the next week. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured it was worth a shot if we were going to figure out how to co-parent or, God forbid, salvage the marriage. It was awkward at first. Jess kept glancing at me, like she was waiting for me to explode or shut down completely. Dr. Walker asked her to explain her side of things. At first, she went into a rehearsed-sounding spiel about how lonely she'd been and how Chris had been there at the wrong time. But when the therapist gently pressed her, she broke down. "I didn't realize how much resentment I was holding on to," she admitted. "Matt works so hard, and I know it's for us, but I felt invisible. And instead of talking to him about it, I made the worst decision of my life." Hearing her admit that felt like someone driving a nail deeper into my chest, but at least it was honest. For once, she wasn't trying to downplay or sugarcoat it. She looked directly at me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I hate myself for what I've done to you, Matt. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you for the chance to earn it." I didn't say much during that session. Mostly, I just listened and tried to keep my emotions in check. Dr. Walker asked me what I needed from Jess to even consider moving forward. I told her, bluntly, transparency, accountability, and time. A lot of time. After the session, Jess and I sat in the car for a few minutes before heading home. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" she asked quietly. I stared out the windshield, thinking about everything Dr. Walker had said. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But I'm willing to keep going to therapy and see where it leads." The days that followed weren't any easier, but there was a shift. Jess started checking in more, not in a clingy way, but in a way that felt like she was genuinely trying to rebuild something. She gave me space when I needed it and made an effort to keep things normal for the kids, who thankfully still seemed oblivious to the tension. I wish I could say therapy gave me all the answers, but the truth is, it only scratched the surface. The pain was still there, and I still didn't know if I could ever forgive her. But at least I wasn't drowning in it anymore. About 3 weeks into therapy, just as I was starting to feel like I might be able to breathe again, life decided to throw me another curveball. It was a Saturday morning, and Jess had taken Ethan to soccer practice while I stayed home with Lily. I was in the middle of reading her a story when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a text from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but the preview caught my attention. "Hey, Matt. You don't know me, but you need to know the truth about Chris." My heart stopped. I quickly set Lily up with her coloring books in the other room and opened the message. The text continued, "Chris is not who Jess thinks he is. He's been sleeping with multiple women, including my wife. I thought you deserved to know." Attached was a screenshot, a series of texts between Chris and this guy's wife. They were flirtatious, explicit, and dated during the same time Jess had been seeing him. The guy, whose name was Mike, offered to call or meet up if I needed more proof. He ended the message with, "I've been in your shoes, man. I'm sorry." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I thought I'd already hit rock bottom, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. Not only had Jess destroyed our marriage for this guy, but it turned out she wasn't even special to him. She was just another notch on his belt. When Jess got home later that day, I was waiting for her in the living room. My heart was racing, and I had to remind myself to stay calm. When she walked in, she looked confused by my expression. "What's wrong?" she asked. I held up my phone. "Who the hell is Chris, really?" Her face went pale, the same way it had when I first confronted her weeks ago. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. "I got a text from his wife's husband, Mike. Apparently, Chris has been sleeping with other women, including Mike's wife. Did you know about this? Or were you just another one of his side pieces?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. I needed answers. Jess looked stunned. I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, Matt, I didn't know. He told me I was the only one. That he wasn't happy in his own marriage, and we had this connection." I laughed bitterly. "A connection? Jess, he was playing you. Just like he played Mike's wife. This whole thing is a joke." She sank into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. "I'm such an idiot," she muttered. "How could I be so stupid?" I didn't answer. The room was filled with this heavy, suffocating silence. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction at seeing her realize just how badly she'd screwed up, not just with me, but with herself. But mostly, I just felt exhausted. Like the emotional roller coaster of the past month had finally derailed. "What do you want me to do?" she asked after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know, Jess. I really don't. But you need to take a good, hard look at yourself and figure out why you let this happen. Because right now, I'm not sure there's anything left to save." That night, I sent Mike a text thanking him for reaching out and confirming everything. He was polite, even empathetic, but it didn't make the situation any easier. If anything, it made me feel worse, like I was part of some twisted support group for people whose lives had been wrecked by this one guy. Jess spent the rest of the weekend walking on eggshells, but I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. I told her I needed space, and for the first time, she actually gave it to me. After the bombshell about Chris, something shifted in me. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was angry. But it wasn't the kind of anger that makes you yell or slam doors. It was the cold, focused kind. The kind that makes you realize you've been giving too much of yourself to people who didn't deserve it. For the first time since this whole thing started, I stopped worrying about how Jess felt or how this would affect her. I started thinking about me. What I wanted. What I needed to move forward. The following Monday, I scheduled another solo session with Dr. Walker. I laid everything out, the affair, Chris's manipulations, Jess's attempts to salvage things. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me. "Matt," he began, "it sounds like you've been spending a lot of energy trying to understand Jess's choices. But have you thought about what you want your life to look like, with or without her?" That question hit me like a ton of bricks. I realized I'd been so focused on her betrayal, so consumed by the pain, that I hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture. What kind of life did I want for myself? For the kids? Did Jess even fit into that vision anymore? I went home that night and told Jess we needed to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, again, that damn table, and I laid it all out. "Jess," I started, "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I want to forgive you. But what I do know is that I can't live like this anymore. I need to figure out who I am without all this noise, without this mess. And to do that, we need to separate." Her face crumpled, but she didn't interrupt. "I'm not saying this has to end in divorce," I continued, "but I need time and space to think. For myself. Not for you. Not for the kids. For me." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to lose you, Matt. But if this is what you need, I'll respect it." We agreed that I'd move into a small rental nearby. That way, I could still be close to the kids and keep things as normal as possible for them. Jess and I would split custody 50-50 for the time being, and we'd tell the kids it was just a temporary arrangement while Mommy and Daddy worked on some things. Packing up my things and leaving the house was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Ethan hugged me tight and asked if I'd be back soon. Lily cried and clung to my leg. I reassured them that I wasn't going far and that we'd still see each other all the time, but the look in their eyes nearly broke me. Jess stood in the doorway as I loaded the last box into my car. "I'll wait for you," she said quietly. "As long as it takes. I'll do whatever you need." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just nodded and drove off. That night, sitting in the tiny living room of my new place, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Sadness, relief, anger, hope, it was all tangled together in a way I couldn't untangle. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a little bit of control. Like I was finally starting to find my footing again. The first week in my new place was brutal. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, instinctively reaching for Jess, only to remember I was alone. The quiet was deafening, and the guilt of not being there for Ethan and Lily weighed on me constantly. But as hard as it was, there was also a strange kind of freedom in it. For the first time in years, I could focus on myself without worrying about someone else's expectations or emotions. I threw myself into routines to keep my mind busy. Work, gym, therapy. On the nights I had the kids, we'd have pizza picnics on the floor, play board games, and watch their favorite movies. Seeing them laugh and smile reminded me that I wasn't a failure as a dad, even if I felt like one as a husband. They were resilient, and that gave me strength. Jess and I kept things civil. She'd drop the kids off at my place or pick them up without much conversation. Occasionally, she'd ask how I was doing, but I kept my answers short. I wasn't ready to let her back in, not yet. Therapy became a lifeline. Dr. Walker helped me see that my self-worth wasn't tied to my marriage or Jess's choices. He encouraged me to start journaling, which felt stupid at first but quickly became a way to process the whirlwind of emotions I was still navigating. Writing down my thoughts made me realize how much of myself I'd lost over the years. Somewhere between being a husband, a dad, and a provider, I'd forgotten who Matt was. About a month into the separation, something unexpected happened. I ran into an old friend, Claire, at the grocery store. We'd gone to college together but hadn't seen each other in years. She was as bubbly and down-to-earth as I remembered, and we ended up chatting for almost an hour in the produce aisle. I wasn't looking for anything romantic, but that conversation reminded me what it felt like to connect with someone without all the baggage. Claire mentioned she was hosting a small get-together with some mutual friends and invited me to come. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to seem like I was running away from my problems, but eventually, I decided to go. I needed to start rebuilding a social life outside of my relationship with Jess. The night of the party, I felt more like myself than I had in months. I laughed, caught up with old friends, and even shared a little about what I'd been going through. Nobody judged me or gave me pitying looks. They just listened. It was exactly what I needed. When I got home that night, I realized something important. I didn't hate Jess. I hated what she'd done, and I hated how it had made me feel, but the anger I'd been holding onto was starting to fade. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but I also didn't want to carry that bitterness forever. It was exhausting. Jess must have noticed the change because the next time she dropped off the kids, she asked if we could talk. I agreed, but only after they were asleep. We sat on the couch, a safe distance apart, and for the first time, the conversation felt less charged. "I've been working on myself," she said. "Therapy has been hard, but it's helped me see how much I've been running from my own issues. What I did to you wasn't just about us, Matt. It was about me. My insecurities, my need for validation. None of that excuses what I did, but I wanted you to know I'm trying to be better, for myself, for the kids, and for you, if there's ever a chance." Her honesty caught me off guard. For weeks, I'd been bracing myself for excuses or manipulations, but this felt different. Still, I wasn't ready to make any promises. "I'm glad you're working on yourself, Jess," I said. "But I need more time. I'm still figuring out who I am without us." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I'll wait." That night, for the first time since the affair, I felt a glimmer of hope, not necessarily for our marriage, but for my future. Whether Jess was part of it or not, I was finally starting to feel like I could move forward. It's been 6 months since I moved out. If you'd told me back then that I'd be where I am now, I wouldn't have believed you. The journey's been messy, emotional, and full of hard choices, but I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. Jess and I have found a rhythm with co-parenting. The kids seem happy, which was my biggest worry. Ethan is still killing it at soccer, and Lily has become obsessed with drawing animals. She's already way better than I ever was. We've done a good job shielding them from the heavier stuff, and for that, I'm proud of both of us. As for Jess and me, we're okay. Not perfect, not back to where we were, but we're in a better place than I thought possible. We've been going to therapy together consistently, and while I can't say the pain is gone, it's dulled enough that I can talk to her without feeling like I'm suffocating. Jess has been doing the work, and it shows. She's more present with the kids, more open about her feelings, and more accountable for her actions. She doesn't try to rush me or push me to make decisions about our future, which I appreciate. She knows I'm still figuring out if I can forgive her, if I even want to forgive her. On my end, I've learned to set boundaries and prioritize my own needs. Therapy has been a game changer for me. It's helped me understand that healing isn't linear, and it doesn't always mean reconciliation. Forgiveness, if it comes, will be for my peace, not for hers. Then there's Claire. She and I have stayed in touch, but it's strictly platonic. For now, that's all I can handle. But talking to her, and others, has reminded me that there's life beyond the bubble of my marriage. Whether it's with Jess or someone else, I know I'll be okay. One of the hardest lessons I've learned through all this is that love alone isn't enough. A marriage requires trust, respect, and communication. Without those, love is just a word. Jess and I had stopped communicating long before Chris came into the picture, and while that doesn't excuse what she did, it's taught me to pay more attention to the cracks before they become craters.